An elderly black woman gets pulled over on a deserted Mississippi road. The cop thinks she's just another nobody until she calmly hands him her Supreme Court ID. What happens next isn't just shocking, it forces an entire town to confront a truth they've long ignored. Stay with us, because this story doesn't end where you think it will. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now, let's get into the story. The old Lincoln glided along the stretch of asphalt like a vessel adrift at sea, unhurried, unbothered, but weathered. The two-lane road between Yazoo City and Natchez, Mississippi, was mostly deserted at this hour, lined with pine trees on one side and fields of tall, silver-tipped grass on the other. The last remnants of dusk clung to the sky like faded ink, and the scent of summer rain still lingered faintly in the air. Inside the car, the air conditioning had given out weeks ago, but Margaret Ellison didn't mind. She liked the feel of the breeze when the window was cracked, the way it whispered across her skin and rustled her scarf as she drove. At 74, Margaret had a softness about her that came not from fragility, but from years of learning when to bend and when not to break. Her hands were still steady on the wheel, her back straight, her gaze unwavering. She had always driven this road home after visiting her sister near Vicksburg. It was familiar, quiet, even comforting in its predictability, until the lights appeared, blue and red, flashing too fast, too close. She noticed them first in the rearview mirror, then again as the cruiser sped up and hugged her tail, headlights glaring. No siren, just pressure. She furrowed her brow and eased her foot off the gas. Had she missed a sign? Crossed a line? There were no intersections, no traffic, nothing but stillness. Until this. Her signal clicked softly as she pulled off onto the gravel shoulder, tires crackling against the dry weeds. She stopped. Engine idle. Hands resting atop the steering wheel exactly at 10 and 2. Just like she'd taught her grandson. Just like she'd told dozens of law clerks and mentees. Stay calm. Stay still. Stay alive. Through the rearview mirror, she watched the cruiser sit motionless for nearly a full minute before the door opened and a figure emerged. The man walking toward her was tall, broad-shouldered, maybe late 30s. The kind of man who looked like he'd spent his life being told he was in charge. His boots crunched the gravel with authority. His left hand hovered near his belt. Not threatening, but not casual either. Margaret didn't flinch. Her window was already lowered halfway. He didn't introduce himself, didn't explain, just leaned slightly forward. "License and registration," he said. His tone wasn't loud. It was worse. Condescending, practiced, laced with entitlement. Margaret turned her head slowly. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" "You swerved," he said flatly. "Just now, near the bend." Her voice was calm. "I don't believe I did." He narrowed his eyes. "You been drinking tonight, ma'am?" "No, sir. I don't drink." He looked her over. Her pressed navy blouse, her pearl earrings, her age. He didn't see dignity. He saw something disposable. His eyes didn't register the gravity in her presence. Only suspicion. "You got any controlled substances in the car?" Weapons? No, sir. Anyone else in the vehicle with you? No. He paused. Step out of the car. She blinked once. Am I being detained? Don't play games, he said, voice sharp now. Out of the car. Now. A breeze picked up through the open window, lifting the edge of her scarf. She did not move. Officer, my identification is in my purse. May I show it to you? His hand shifted slightly toward the holster on his hip. Keep your hands where I can see them. Margaret didn't argue. She remained still. She had sat on higher benches than this man would ever approach, had signed opinions that shaped the nation, had walked through protests, flanked by bodyguards, her name in headlines. And yet here she was, alone on a dark Mississippi road, being asked to step out of her car without cause. Behind her, the blue lights cast shifting shadows into the trees. Her heart beat slow, but hard. Step out, he repeated, with an edge now sharpened by the fear of being challenged. She inhaled deeply. I would like to show you my ID before I exit the vehicle. He leaned closer, his breath tinged with impatience. We'll get to that. Step out. She studied him for a moment. The tight jaw, the sweat forming along his temple, the way he looked at her as if she were not someone, just something to manage. She reached, slowly and deliberately, for her bag, her hand moving like a dancer's, measured, elegant, sure. Don't reach, he barked. I'm not reaching, she said, voice even. I am retrieving my identification. A beat of silence followed, tense, pulled taut like a wire. Then she unzipped the leather case, removed a single item, and held it in her palm. Here, she said, offering it out the window. He hesitated, then took it with a flick of his hand. His eyes dropped to the badge inside. His mouth parted. Then he froze. He read the words once, then again. His throat moved like he was swallowing something dry and bitter. Margaret Ellison, Associate Justice, Supreme Court of the United States. There was a shift in the air, not dramatic, not loud, but seismic. He looked up at her as if seeing her for the first time. And maybe, in some way, he was. She didn't smirk. She didn't lean forward. She just asked gently, would it have mattered if you knew? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. And for the first time since the lights flashed behind her, Margaret smiled. Not out of pride, not out of triumph, but because the moment had revealed the truth. Sharp, undeniable, and unforgettable. This wasn't about who she was. It was about who he thought she wasn't. And the night wasn't over yet. The silence that followed was not peace. It was performance. Officer Chase Dennard stood beside the car, Margaret Ellison's credentials still in his hand, eyes locked on the golden seal. He wasn't breathing. Not really. Just holding himself upright in a moment that had collapsed the entire narrative he'd written in his head the second he saw her through that window. Elderly, alone, black, vulnerable, unremarkable. He had told himself this was routine, that he was just doing his job. But now, with the Supreme Court insignia staring up at him, everything he thought he knew about her shattered into something uncomfortable. The truth. He returned the badge to her with a hesitance that spoke more than words. Not because he respected the title, but because now he feared what it could do to him. I didn't know, he muttered, as if ignorance was a shield, as if saying it aloud might absolve him. Margaret took the badge with a small, steady hand. She placed it gently in her coat pocket, brushing a speck of dust off her lapel with a grace that had no interest in punishing him, but would not let him forget. Most people don't, she said. That's the problem. Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't theatrical. It simply landed. And it stayed. Chase stood there, suddenly unsure of what to do with his arms, his authority, his training. None of it seemed to apply anymore. His script had crumbled. He was left only with assumptions, exposed now under the pale Mississippi moon like a scar he couldn't cover. He stepped back. I wasn't trying to cause any harm. Margaret looked out the windshield. Intent and impact don't always shake hands, officer. He blinked. He wanted to retreat, to get back in his car, to make this moment end. But he couldn't move. Shame had its own gravitational force, and it was stronger than his badge tonight. The road behind them remained empty, as though the world itself had paused to watch him reckon with what he had done. Not with malice, but with something more insidious. Assumption. Assumption draped in the thin veil of authority. Assumption disguised as routine. That's what people didn't talk about when they spoke of systemic injustice. They thought it was all slurs and violence and videos gone viral. But this was how it lived in daylight. In stops without reason. In the tone of a voice. In the way a man approaches a woman at night with no introduction, and with full expectation of control. It lived in questions that came without cause, in commands that expected compliance, not respect. Margaret had felt it before, not just in traffic stops, in courtrooms, in elevators, on conference calls when her name was the only one they didn't recognize as a justice's. And each time, she chose whether to confront it or let it pass. Tonight, she hadn't planned to do either. She just wanted to go home. I don't know what else to say, Chase offered. Then say nothing, she replied. Sometimes silence is the first step toward listening. He stepped back again, a silent permission for her to leave. But Margaret didn't start the engine. Not yet. Do you know? She asked after a long pause. What story you were telling yourself about me when you pulled me over? He didn't answer. Because you were telling one. We all do. The question is whether we're willing to confront how wrong we might be. Chase's face flushed with something more than embarrassment. Recognition. She wasn't lecturing him. She was holding a mirror up to his training, his instincts, his unconscious narratives. You saw an old black woman, she said. You didn't ask where I came from. You assumed it didn't matter. She wasn't trying to humiliate him. She was trying to shake something loose. And something did shake. Chase looked down at the ground, the gravel beneath his boots. It's how we're taught, not formally, but it's the culture. You watch the hands. You assume non-compliance. You always expect trouble, so you're never surprised. That's not culture, she said gently. That's fear. And fear, when it wears a badge, becomes danger. He looked up at her, eyes searching for something. Absolution, perhaps. But Margaret didn't offer it. What she offered instead was truth. This will never be about me, officer. I'll go home tonight. But the girl driving her mother's car in Tupelo, the boy riding his bike back from the library in Jackson, they don't carry badges that protect them from assumptions. She turned the key in the ignition. The engine hummed to life. Chase stepped back further, humbled not by power, but by a quiet authority that had asked for nothing, and yet demanded everything. She pulled back onto the road with the slow grace of someone who had seen too much to rush. As her taillights faded into the darkness, Chase remained rooted where he stood, flooded with a new kind of noise, the echo of everything he didn't know he didn't know. Because sometimes the loudest wake-up call isn't screamed. It's spoken in a voice that refuses to shrink, one that doesn't need volume to be heard. And for the first time in his career, Officer Chase Dennard realized his job wasn't to control the story. It was to question why he ever thought he could write it alone. The night air held its breath after Margaret Ellison drove off, leaving nothing but fading tail lights and the echo of truth still ringing in the space between them. Officer Chase Dennard didn't move for several long minutes. His hand rested on his belt out of habit, but there was no authority behind the gesture anymore. It was just weight. His cruiser stood parked behind him, headlights casting harsh beams across the gravel and pine-lined road like theater lights left on long after the actor exited the stage. But the show wasn't over. Not for Chase. He climbed back into his patrol SUV and sat silently, his fingers resting just above the radio mic. He didn't press it. What could he say? Pulled over a Supreme Court justice and lectured her about trunk searches? There was no category for that in his report system. And anyway, he wasn't ready to file anything. Not when the weight of what just happened was still pressing against his chest like a hand he couldn't remove. He reached into the glove compartment, not to search, but to find a pen, and stared at his incident log. The paper remained blank. The words wouldn't come. Something deeper was unraveling now. Not just the memory of her ID, but the conviction in her voice. Not anger, not righteousness, just certainty. A woman who didn't need to argue, because the truth already sat so squarely on her shoulders, it didn't require a defense. He closed the notebook and stared out through the windshield. The Georgia woods were dark, the kind of darkness that didn't just hide trees, but buried memory. He sat there and tried to remember the first time he made a stop like that. Nothing big, nothing dramatic. Just a routine check, a question asked with too much suspicion and too little cause. A teenager once, then a young man walking back from work, then a mother with her kids. None of it had felt wrong at the time, not until now. For the next several days, Chase said nothing. Not to his partner, not to his supervisor, not to his wife. Something in him had begun to fold inward, a slow inventory of assumptions long left unexamined. He thought of the way Margaret said his name, not with threat, but with precision, like she wanted him to carry it differently after that night. He began to notice the way he walked into gas stations, how people looked at his uniform first, not his face. He noticed how his own shoulders straightened when he saw a black driver, even when they were doing nothing, especially then. He started asking questions in his head before asking them aloud. Why am I stopping this car? Would I treat this differently if they looked like me? He hated how often the answers came with discomfort. A week passed, then another. And still, he couldn't let go of her words. That badge doesn't excuse your blindness. It rang like scripture, a version of justice he had never heard in his academy training, but now couldn't unhear. He drove the same stretch of road again one night, not on patrol, just thinking. It was quiet, familiar. The church with the tilted sign still stood crooked in the dusk. The breeze moved like memory, and for a moment, Chase imagined her car in front of him again. Soft headlights, calm hands, a steady voice, refusing to fold. He pulled over, this time by choice, parking on the gravel shoulder where the encounter had unfolded. He sat there in the dark for a long time. Then finally, he pulled out his department-issued notebook and began to write. Not a report, but a confession. Not for anyone else, just for himself. The first line was shaky. "I made a stop last week that changed how I see the badge." The words spilled out from there. He wrote about how he'd grown up in a household where law enforcement was revered but never questioned. How he once saw his uncle pin a boy to the hood of a car for mouthing off and thought that was what strength looked like. He wrote about how power could be invisible until it was misused. About how Margaret Ellison had not raised her voice once, and yet her silence felt louder than anything he'd heard on duty. He didn't know what to do with the pages yet, but he knew he couldn't forget them. Later that week, Chase attended a departmental workshop he normally skipped. It was optional bias training, the kind most officers dismissed as political noise. But that day, he stayed. He didn't speak. He just listened. One of the trainers asked the group, "Have you ever been the danger in someone else's story without meaning to be?" The room went quiet. Chase's pen didn't move, but his breath did. On Friday, after his shift, he sat in the station parking lot and stared at the courthouse building across the square. He thought about walking in, asking to speak to someone, maybe even finding a way to reach Margaret Ellison's office. But he didn't. He wasn't ready yet, not to be forgiven. He wasn't even sure he deserved that. He was only sure of one thing. He had seen something that night that wouldn't let him go. Not her credentials, her composure. A woman who held the full weight of history on her shoulders and still chose grace instead of fire. And that choice, that power, had forced him to reckon with everything he thought he knew. Sometimes, Chase realized, it doesn't take a lawsuit or a protest to change a man. Sometimes, it takes a mirror. And sometimes that mirror is a black woman on the shoulder of a quiet southern road, refusing to disappear. The church was quiet that Sunday. Not silent, but quiet in the way an old soul breathes. Measured, dignified, waiting. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, casting streaks of soft red and gold across the worn oak pews. The sanctuary of Shady Grove Baptist Church had stood in Montgomery, Alabama for over a century. It had seen baptisms, funerals, weddings, protests, and prayers. It had held both sorrow and hope in equal measure. This morning, it held something else: expectation. Margaret Ellison had been coming to Shady Grove since before she could walk. Her mother brought her in starched dresses with patent leather shoes, made her sit still through sermons longer than she could comprehend. Her father, a deacon, always said, "The church don't need to shout to stir a soul." Over the years, Margaret had spoken in this very pulpit. Eulogies, lectures, sometimes just a verse of scripture for Black History Month. But this morning, she didn't come with a title or a speech. She came with a decision. She'd said nothing about the incident on Highway 129 since it happened. Not to her clerks. Not to the press. She didn't need headlines. She needed a moment. A place to breathe out the weight she'd carried for weeks. Reverend Holloway had asked gently, "Would you say a few words at the end of service?" Nothing official. Just share what's on your heart. She had nodded without thinking. So now, after the choir's final hymn faded, after the last "Amen" hummed through the pews, Margaret stood from her seat near the back, her navy coat buttoned tight despite the warmth. Her steps were steady but slow, cane tapping lightly against the tile floor as she approached the front. Some congregants murmured, recognizing her presence before the pastor announced it. A few stood as she passed, a gesture of reverence for the woman many had watched grow from a curious child into one of the highest legal voices in the land. Margaret didn't speak right away when she reached the microphone. She let the quiet hold its shape. It wasn't discomfort that made the room still. It was attention. "I wasn't planning to say much," she began, her voice soft but anchored. "But something happened to me recently that I haven't been able to forget, and maybe you need to hear it." She didn't mention Officer Chase Dennard by name. She didn't need to. What mattered wasn't him. It was the way he moved, the way his words carried assumptions shaped by generations. She described the blue lights, the questions that came before any explanations, the way his hand moved toward his holster when hers moved to her purse. Her tone never sharpened. She didn't ask for sympathy. She simply laid out the truth, clean and bare, like gospel. "What scared me most," she said, "was not that he stopped me, but how easily I recognized the script. I've lived too many years for this to still surprise me. But it did. It reminded me that some uniforms still see us as a threat before they see us as human." There were tears in the congregation now, some from elders who'd lived similar moments, others from the younger generation who feared one day they might. She paused, eyes scanning the pews. "But I'm not angry. Anger burns too fast. I'm tired. Tired that even after a lifetime of service, even with a Supreme Court badge in my pocket, I still have to prove I belong on a road my taxes paid to pave." The silence thickened. No one moved. The church, always a place of refuge, now bore witness to a truth too many kept tucked away. Margaret lifted her gaze. "I share this because I want us to remember that change doesn't only come from protest. It also comes from presence, from speaking even when no one expects you to, from staying calm when you have every right to rage." Her voice softened. "I didn't raise mine that night. I didn't need to. Because sometimes the loudest sound in the world is a quiet woman saying no." A few gasps broke the quiet. A hum of affirmation rippled through the back. She looked down for a moment, then closed with something simple. "If one person walks out of here today and chooses to look twice before judging, if one child feels seen, if one officer thinks twice before assuming, they won't know it, but they'll be changed by what happened that night. That's enough for me." She stepped back from the microphone without fanfare. No applause followed, just stillness. A sacred pause filled with collective breath, reverence, reflection. And then the whispers began. Not the kind born of gossip, but of reverence. Soft exchanges between pews. "Did you hear what she said?" "I didn't know." "Lord have mercy. She's right." The kind of whispers that don't fade when the service ends. The kind that travel through kitchens and classrooms, barbershops, and buses. Outside the church, beneath the wide arms of the live oak, a teenage girl named Alyssa waited, her notebook clutched against her chest. She had heard Margaret speak, and something inside her shifted. She approached slowly, unsure. "Justice Ellison?" she asked. Margaret turned, her face kind. "I," Alyssa faltered. "I've never heard anyone say it like that." "Thank you." Margaret smiled. "You're welcome, baby." Alyssa looked down. "I want to write about what you said. For my school newspaper. Can I?" "Of course," Margaret replied. "Write it true, and write it for someone who hasn't found their voice yet." The girl nodded and walked away, her steps quicker now. Behind them, the church bells rang. And just like that, a story born of silence found its way into the wind, carried not by shouts, but by whispers that would echo far beyond the church doors. Whispers that could change things. Whispers strong enough to wake a city still pretending not to hear. The days that followed Margaret Ellison's quiet revelation at Shady Grove unfolded with no fanfare, no headlines, and no grand declarations. But something in Montgomery shifted. At first, it was imperceptible, a longer pause during conversations, a hush that settled over familiar gathering places. A story was making its way through the city, not with the wildfire of scandal, but like water through soil, slow, patient, inevitable. People weren't just repeating what Margaret had said. They were remembering how she had said it, the stillness of her voice, the calm weight of her presence, the absence of vengeance in her truth. Back at her home on Rosewood Street, Margaret moved through her routines like always. Mornings started with coffee in a ceramic mug, older than most of her clerks, followed by reading briefs and circling headlines in red ink. But every so often, she'd pause, her eyes lingering on the magnolia outside her kitchen window, the same tree that had stood since she was a girl. The silence now felt different, fuller. It carried echoes of voices she'd stirred without raising her own. One afternoon, a letter arrived in a simple envelope. Inside was a note handwritten in careful script. "Thank you for showing my daughter what strength looks like in stillness," it read. No signature, no return address. Margaret tucked it inside a worn, leather-bound journal she kept on her bookshelf, a collection of letters, thoughts, and memories from a life lived mostly in rooms where she was the only black woman, the only elder, the only voice holding the line. Elsewhere, the ripple continued. A young officer named Garrett, new to the Montgomery force, heard the story from a church elder who stopped him during a patrol. That woman, Justice Ellison, she didn't shout. She didn't even threaten. But she made that man fold like paper. The elder chuckled, but Garrett didn't. He looked down at the badge on his chest and wondered what he'd have done in Officer Dennard's place. At Northside High, Alyssa Jenkins posted her article on the school's website. "Power doesn't always wear a uniform or speak with volume," she wrote. "Sometimes it sits behind a steering wheel, waiting for the world to see it for what it is." The article spread quickly, shared among students and teachers alike. Some read it silently, others read it aloud. And though Margaret would never know each name or face her words reached, she understood something deeper. That legacy isn't about visibility, it's about resonance. One evening, long after sunset, she sat again beneath the magnolia, sipping tea as cicadas buzzed in the distance. Her cane rested beside her chair. In her lap, a letter from a law student at Howard University. The student wrote, "I never knew I could hold the law in one hand and grace in the other until I heard what you did. You gave me permission to believe both could coexist." Margaret folded the letter gently and smiled, not out of pride, but out of peace. Because the world hadn't changed overnight. It hadn't apologized or made amends, but it had listened. And for someone like her, who had built a life on reason and restraint, that was no small miracle. She didn't need a monument. She didn't need a parade. She just needed to know that when the next woman, black, alone, unseen, was pulled over on some back road in America, maybe the officer would remember. Maybe he'd hesitate. Maybe he'd pause long enough to think, long enough to see her. And in that pause, change could begin. That was her legacy. Not carved in stone, but carried in silence, spoken in whispers, etched in the quiet. Margaret Ellison's story isn't one about confrontation. It's not about courtroom victories, legal jargon, or grand speeches from marble steps. It's about restraint, about the kind of unshakable dignity forged not in headlines, but in silence, in the countless moments when the world tried to tell her she was less, and she simply refused to believe it. She wasn't trying to make history on that quiet road between Selma and Montgomery. She was just trying to get home after a Sunday dinner with her sister-in-law. Just another black woman, aging gracefully, wearing her late husband's coat and carrying a Tupperware full of peach cobbler. But history has a way of finding people who carry it. When Officer Dennard pulled her over, he didn't see a Supreme Court justice. He saw someone he thought he could intimidate, someone he assumed would bend to his authority without resistance. What he found instead was a woman who knew exactly who she was and who had no intention of making a scene, because she didn't need to. Margaret's refusal to be provoked, her calm insistence on legality, her quiet but firm voice, all of it worked together not to punish, but to reveal. She didn't lash out. She didn't even raise her voice. She held up a mirror and let the officer see himself. And in that moment, he wasn't a man in control. He was a man exposed. And that's what makes her story unforgettable. Because it reminds us that power isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's the quietest voice in the room. The one that doesn't flinch, doesn't falter, doesn't feed the fire, but stands firm in truth. Margaret taught us that justice doesn't always come from punishment. Sometimes, it comes from awakening. In the days that followed, she didn't seek the spotlight. She didn't post the story online or grant interviews. She told her truth once, in a small church before a modest crowd, and then she let it go. But the echo of her words rippled out, through whispered conversations, through classrooms, through homes and police precincts alike. What began as a quiet stand became a lesson passed hand to hand. So what can we learn from Justice Ellison's story? We learn that it's not titles or positions that demand respect. It's how we carry them. That we don't need cameras to make a difference. Sometimes, the most powerful protest is simply refusing to be moved by ignorance or fear. And most importantly, we learn that change often starts in small places, with one story, one decision, one moment of clarity in a clouded world. To those watching, you don't have to be a judge to stand for what's right. You don't need a robe, a badge, or a platform. You need patience. You need courage. And above all, you need to remember who you are when the world tries to tell you otherwise. Speak truth, even when it trembles in your throat. And when the moment comes, don't let it pass you by in silence. Because someone, somewhere, is watching you, learning how to respond by the way you hold your ground. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the quiet strength we so often overlook, then do us one small favor. Like this video. Subscribe to the channel. Share it with someone who still believes in grace, in justice, and in the kind of dignity that doesn't demand attention, but commands it. Your voice matters, and so do the stories we choose to carry forward. Let's keep telling them together.